I want to welcome you to our course this evening, essentially Working with Anxiety in Congregations, brought to you by the MidAmerica Region of the UUA. My name is the Reverend Sharon Dittmar, and I'm a Congregational Life Consultant in the MidAmerica Region of Congregations. I also want to thank all of you for the congregations you are in for contributing to the annual program fund. It is your gifts that bring you this webinar for free. So thank you so much. So here we go. So can you nod your head if you're now looking at two books that say resources? Excellent, then my shared screen plan has worked. Here are two of the books that I use when I teach this class. One is Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times. I actually think this is the single best book I've ever used to deal with congregational anxiety, change, stress, conflict. When I was a parish minister, I was a parish minister for 19 years. I would say every 2 to 3 years, I would take this one off the shelf and I'd read it cover to cover. And it would help me every time. It was amazing. There was always a new nugget for me. It's by Peter Steinke, S-T-E-I-N-K-E. I think he's really terrific at the work he puts out. The subtitle is Being Calm and Courageous No Matter What. It is, along with Dan Hotchkiss's book, Governance in Ministry, I think the two most essential books I used for church management, cultural management when I was in the congregation. The other book I used a lot is Leadership Without Easy Answers by Ronald Heifetz. Now, this is over 20 years old now, and he has written more recent things, but anything by Ronald Heifetz is also great. He comes from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Also, if you look at the bottom of the screen, and again, this webinar will appear actually online in about a week on our website, and you'll receive notification of that. So everything in these slides is going to appear for you again to look at your leisure. But some of the work I'm talking about is a model called Family Systems Theory, and there are several people who've worked on it, and I've looked a little bit at the work of the Bowen Family Center or the Bowen Center for Family Study, and you can see their website is right here. If you get into this and you want to learn more, it's there for you. And with all resources, I always say take what you like and leave the rest, right? And you're allowed to disagree. All right, so here's a quote I have. Let's think about this one, Peter Steinke. Working with anxious congregations, I always remind them that they have invited me to help them not to waste their suffering. The leader will need to challenge the congregation, anxious souls, as they may be, to use anxious times as a springboard for change, learning, and different functioning. I really love this quote because here is someone suggesting that times of anxiety can be productive, that we can learn things, and that they can offer opportunities while acknowledging it's also a period of suffering and challenge. So it's all those things at once, all right? Here's another quote. Peter Steinke. Leaders today cannot be as anxious as the people they serve. You know, I feel like this quote might have been written for me and all of us who are leaders, because so often we feel unequipped, maybe lacking training, lacking patience, time, insight, any number of things that we really wish we had or needed, particularly when situations get difficult, feelings are hurt, hard words are exchanged, mistakes are made and continue to be made. And yet part of the challenge is embracing and accepting the mistakes and not leading with our anxiety. When we lead with our anxiety, we often have a forced sense of urgency, a sense of needing to do everything perfectly, and that often creates more problems instead of opening up to a more creative mindset. As we go through this material, you're going to see where when we are anxious, we lose our ability to be creative. I know this is not rocket science. You're like, yeah, that does sound really true. So, and I think we're also living in anxious times. Since 2016, I would say the anxiety in America has risen enormously. I've noticed it in our congregations. I've noticed it in America. I've noticed it in the world. I've noticed it in the UUA. So it's even harder. We have more pressures upon us as we're attempting to lead in this climate. And yet, right, there's opportunities. So let's just be honest for a minute though. Sometimes it feels like that little orangutan on the right, That's me when I've made a mistake, when my intent was good and my impact was painful to someone else. That little orangutan is probably all of us. And we hope there's someone on the other side laughing and smiling, but we all know that's not always true, right? Sometimes there's someone incredibly angry and rightfully so at us. But I'd like to humanize it with our primate friends here, that it's hard work. It's hard work, and it's okay. It's okay. All right, so here's my first question for you, and here's where someone had asked me before I got on, are we going to be graded on what we write? And I said no, but when you hear the question, you're probably going to wish that you were. So here's the question. I'm honestly going to give you 5 or so minutes to write about this. How was conflict addressed in your childhood home? And what role or roles did you play in conflict in your childhood home? We're going to take 5 minutes now. And I want you to write on that. And believe it or not, what you write is going to become very important to your understanding about anxiety and systems and what you can control in the midst of anxiety and conflict. All right. So when I teach this in a class, I always ask a few brave souls to share with me something they've written, but due to the format, I won't ask that, but I'll tell you some of the responses I've gotten. When I ask how was conflict addressed in your home, people say it wasn't. People say I don't know. There was stalking around and slammed doors, and I never knew why or when. People said there were outbursts. Some people said it scared me. People were so loud. Some people have said to me, I tried to make everyone calm down. I got so frightened. Some people said to me I had to be the joker. So people have a number of different roles. And something important that happens is we're kind of imprinted with ideas about conflict from our primary homes, however that is. Often we have different family members who model different things for us too, which is really confusing. You could have a parent or guardian who acts a certain way, but your other parent or guardian or grandparent acts a different way. Some of us have more comfort in some zone or another, but it's very important to be aware of what is your experience of comfort, what is your safety zone in conflict, and what is your fear zone in conflict, right? And what roles have you played before? Were you always trying to fix things? Were you the identified problem? Were you the child who always caused a problem in your home? And although you weren't the real problem, everyone was always like, you were the bad kid. All of these things come into play in this. You'll see, we'll get there. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit about anxious systems, and this comes from Bowen family system theory, and you can read a lot more about this. There are several symptoms, according to Bowen, Murray Bowen, of anxious systems, okay? And anxious systems are one where people have very heightened emotions they don't know what to do with, and their emotions are so heightened they often feel like they need to push them underground or act on them, okay? So one system is something called, or one symptom is something called emotional fusion. And this is a quote from Bowen, the Bowen website. It happens when people lose their self. It occurs when both are nice to one another to tighten their bonds, or when each one functions to take care of the other person's feeling. Congregations are uniquely vulnerable to fusion. People resist information that might disturb their peace. No one wants to speak the truth. If people are emotionally linked, they might not have sufficient space to challenge one another. So forgive me, this actually comes from Steinke. This is his definition of emotional fusion. But I see emotional fusion where it's like everyone has to agree, and if there's any dissent, it's you're cast out. I see this often in family systems where, for example, someone's not invited to the funeral because someone's afraid they'll cry. And I'm like, that's a lot of anxiety. The first thing I think is that's a lot of anxiety in a system. So sometimes it's like we all agree here, and if anyone has a dissenting voice, they must be a troublemaker, right? So that's one sign of anxiety. It's not a sign that everything's okay. Here's a flip side to that. It's not so that surprising when you think of it. It's something called emotional cutoff. Again, from Steinke, cutoff is reactive. It's an automatic defense. A well-defined stance is chosen, thought through, and clearly expressed. When cut off, a person attempts to gain a sense of identity over and against another person. By projecting a negative label on another, the person seeks to gain a positive identity for him or herself. The emotional distancer often becomes dogmatic, opinionated, and doctrinaire. So cutoff is like, I can't deal with you because you get angry a lot, so I'm just not going to talk to you anymore. That's a sign of anxiety. Now, there are situations where we all need to get out of difficult situations. I'm not talking about a situation of abuse. I am talking, though, about a situation where you don't agree with someone, you don't like what they say, and someone walks out of the room, right? They're gone. You said, let's do the family budget, and they walked out the door because they couldn't deal with it, okay? So that's emotional cutoff. It's a sign of anxiety, all right? When these things happen, I don't say to myself anymore, that person's an idiot. The first thing I say is, that person has a lot of anxiety. Okay, good to know. Something about emotional fusion and emotional cutoff. I feel, I'm not making a political statement, but I do feel that our best current example of that is the President of the United States, who, when I watch his behavior, I think must be profoundly anxious because he does a bunch of cutoff and fusion. And I think to myself, oh, he's made it so clear for us to see that that's anxiety, okay? Here's another one. Before I begin on this one, it's called Triangulation. You might have heard of it. I also need to put it in a bit of a cultural context. So in some cultures, triangulation is incredibly positive, and it is the way business is done, and it is not necessarily a sign of anxiety, and it is not a problem. So some people have told me that in Asian, Southeast Asian cultures, it's very normative to involve like an elder in something. So I don't want us to also just be thinking that all these things can be slapped on everyone and then we have a label for everyone and then we know where we are. Sometimes it takes some real mindfulness and sensitivity to nuances and differences of culture and identity and expression, okay? But one way this can go bad in some situations is when there's a source of tension. So you see here, party A and party B are having a bit of an issue. And instead of talking about it directly, they're trying to bring in a third person. It's one of the reasons sometimes in our congregational systems, it's like someone has difficult feedback for the board president, but instead of saying it to the president's face, they go out in the parking lot and they talk about it to 10 other people, and it's not considered really positive when that happens. That's not like going to talk to an elder or getting some good advice. That's triangulation, okay? So it's always best in our congregations in general to try and speak directly to people in a timely fashion that is calm and respectful when we feel like there's an issue, and private. You know, it doesn't help to try and embarrass people in front of other people, right? That doesn't tend to reduce anxiety, that raises anxiety. As someone once said to me, surprised people often behave badly. So when that is possible, that's the way you go about it. Now, there's a whole other level of scenarios that can hear. What if what if party A doesn't want to hear the feedback, or you try and do it direct and timely and they still don't hear it, right? So there can be reasons to involve a third person. Sometimes people feel unsafe giving someone feedback, right? So I don't want to say that this is a model for understanding every situation every time and labeling something good or bad, but it's something to be mindful of. If you had some feedback and you felt safe giving it to someone, did you try and give it to them directly? Did you try and hear what they had to say? And I'm not talking, by the way, about Facebook posting it, which is another sign of anxiety, but like trying to talk to someone on the phone or face-to-face, all right? Okay, anxious systems. Find scapegoats. Someone's got to be to blame here, right? If that canvas didn't work out, it's got to be someone's fault. Someone didn't do their work, right? Rather than, so anxious systems look for a scapegoat. So it's like the canvas was $50,000 short. It's Fred's problem. Fred didn't run a good canvas this year. But did Fred get support? Did the board ever ask what was going on? Did Fred ask for help and people didn't volunteer? Did Fred say, I'm not particularly good at this, and no one helped, right? Generally, answers are more complicated. Anxious people want easy answers of right or wrong, and I just think life is often a bit more nuanced and complicated. Anxious systems also find blame and shame. Like if you start feeling yourself kind of shame triggered, like, oh, I feel shameful about what I said, or like, it could be you're in a system that's anxious, all right? I then try and have compassion for the system and compassion for myself, because it's hard to feel shame. It's a painful feeling for most of us. Anxious systems are often contagious. Isn't this interesting? When you start to see one person worrying, the next person worries. If you can get the calm person to worry, my goodness, 10 people worry, right? So often our anxiety tags on to other people. Anxious systems also have something called identified patients. That's when you say it's one person's problem. So where we often see this in family systems theory, and those of you who know about this from training you might have in therapy, there's often, for example, like quote unquote child or teenager who acts out, you know, Demetria is always so difficult. She's always so difficult. Is she really so difficult, or do people yell all the time at home and so she cuts class, right? Maybe she's just the identified problem for some larger pain or anxiety in the system, right? So those are some other things I think about when I see these also tell me a system is anxious, it's disturbed, it's going to have a hard time talking about difficult things well, all right? It's going to have a hard time being creative and problem solving and trusting because it's anxious. Okay. So here, let's look at some things. Anxiety and systems. These two gentlemen look pretty upset. I know you've never been to a congregational meeting. that looked like that ever. But here's what anxiety does in our system for ourselves. It decreases our capacity to learn. We're so upset, flooded with feeling. I recently saw something where when you have an intense emotional response, it takes you essentially a second to have the intense emotional response. And the briefest time you can calm it down is 20 minutes. So we get, as human beings, we can get flooded with emotions of fear or anger in a second. And the fastest we're going to calm down is 20 minutes. It could be 20 days, it could be 20 years, it could be never, right? So it's very easy to get concerned. And then anxiety decreases our capacity to learn. It replaces curiosity for a demand for certainty, right? Well, what's the answer? What's the answer? Did Fred cause all the problems or not? You know, if we just never have Fred do it again, then we'll fix everything. And that's the problem. So anxious people want to find the answer or the scapegoat. They often haven't looked deep enough to figure out what part of the system is not supporting the whole. So sure, you can take Fred out as the canvas chair and you can put Mariah in Fred's place, and they don't do any better because the whole system still is struggling, right? So that's when we have to be mindful about trying to look for an easy answer. Stiffens our positions over against another's. I know from my personal experience, I've had this happen when I felt anxious. I just stuck my boots in the ground. No, you know. Interrupts concentration, simplifies ways of thinking. It's yes, no, or either or. And if any of you have looked at any of the work by Kenneth Jones and Tema Akun on characteristics of systemic white supremacy, they talk a lot about either or thinking and a sense of urgency and a desire for perfection. So all of these things get more promoted in anxious systems, okay? Prompts a desire for a quick fix, just take the pain away, even if it's not a great, I know many of us have been in situations in congregations or in leadership where we did something to short-term take the pain away, but long-term made the problem worse, right? We ignore, for example, a bully in the congregation, right? People with bullying, actually I should say that better. Instead of saying bullies, I think it's a little bit better to say people with bullying behaviors, right? So we think if we just push it under the rug, it'll go away, and instead it resurfaces 2 years later, 4 years later. Arouses feelings of helplessness. A lot of us just feel like, oh, I don't know what to do, I feel stuck. Leads to an array of defensive behaviors. It's not my responsibility. I didn't vote for that person. Diminishes flexibility in response to life's challenges, creates imaginative gridlock, and floods the nervous system so that we cannot hear what is said. We literally cannot hear what is said. So when I look at that photo of those two gentlemen, I just think they're both probably enraged and terrified and really anxious. I bet it's really hard for them to hear one another, be creative, find shared or common ground. All right. Some more writing for you based on some of the things I talked about. Remember, we talked about emotional cutoff. You get so anxious, you have to push someone away. Emotional fusion, you're so anxious, you think everyone has to agree, and if anyone disagrees, they're disloyal. Triangulation, you bring in a third person or group to support you or cover for you or explain for you because it's too hard for you to do it directly, okay? So I want you to consider a recent conflict in your congregation, and I want you to write for a few minutes about where did you observe emotional fusion or cutoff, triangulation, and identified patients or people who received the blame, okay? So by the way, the questions I've given you, you can apply this to any situation that feels really emotionally charged for you, whether it's at work, at your congregation, in your family. This can be a helpful exercise that you can use to figure out how you want to position yourself. Sometimes some of the worst mistakes I've actually made have been when I was anxious and I thought I had to do something, but I didn't stop to think about what would be the better thing to do. I just did something, right? I wasn't even sure of how I was positioning myself in something. I was just responding, and responding out of anxiety. And like I used to tell my son when he was little, the only person you can control is you. And sometimes how you can control or comport yourself can shift a situation a little bit, and no, it will not end suffering, and no, it won't always make things better, but you can rest assured you did what you could and what you really wanted to do and what felt true to you, instead of just responding out of anxiety. So there is a different way to go about things instead of just always being anxious all the time. The first thing is called a non-anxious presence. Now, when I was in seminary, we had a joke about this. We called it the anxious non-presence, because when you're anxious, that's what you feel like. But what you're trying to be, and this comes from some work also by Ed Friedman, Generation to Generation, has written about this. To be a non-anxious presence, you focus on your own behavior and its modification rather than being preoccupied with how others function. I mean, we don't control other people. We don't control groups. We don't control neighborhoods. We don't control families. We don't control spouses or children or anything, right? The only thing we can control, if we're lucky, is ourselves, and we can't always control our health or how we look or any number of things about ourselves on a daily basis. But the best bet we have is just ourselves. So one of the important things to know is, no, you're actually probably not going to put out the fire in your congregation, the metaphorical fire, right? But you can choose to differentiate yourself and to not get caught up in the anxiety. So if someone, runs up to you after services and says, "Can you believe that? Billy was fighting in the kitchen with Leroy. I heard them. What are you going to do?" You can say, I don't know. You could pause for a minute. You could wait if they say, "I didn't know what to do." And you can say, "Well, what did that feel like?" But, not every question is yours to solve. Not every problem can be solved by you. And sometimes just being thoughtful and stopping and taking a breath is really helpful. I've heard Alex Capitan from Transforming Heart Collective talk about that a lot. Take a breath. You get confused, you're feeling overwhelmed. Take a breath. Just take a breath. And focus on your own behavior. I did that a lot. I would just try and model being calm and being honest about if I didn't know. Here's another one, self-differentiation, the capacity to take I positions based on principles and to stay connected to others in a responsible way. This is self-differentiation. It balances individuality and togetherness. It can create positive emotional field that influences the congregation to withstand anxiety. So just because someone wants you to solve the fight in the kitchen doesn't mean you have to, right? That you might be like, I don't solve kitchen fights. I'm the worship chair. I'm the music director. I really don't deal with kitchen fights, right? You can also focus on what do you care about? I take I positions. When I was a minister, I'd be like, I'm focused on the mission of the congregation. This is what I care about. It's not about making people happy, because I can't make everyone happy, because not everyone's made happy the same way. My job here is not to serve the staff or the members or the highest donor or the longest term member. It's to serve the mission. So that was my I stand. And that sometimes helped me think about, well, what am I basing my value on? I'm here to serve the mission of the congregation. Is what I'm doing, saying, doing that. Okay, that was my self-differentiation. You might have yours. All right, so here's some example. When we're undifferentiated, we accommodate, please, and act to relieve the pain of others. We focus outside the self. Are you happy now? Are you happy now? Are you happy now? If we worry about that a lot, that's really the highway to our own unhappiness, right? We'll never make everyone happy. Undifferentiation connects emotionally, so-and-so is sad, now I'm sad. So-and-so is mad, now I'm mad. I don't know about you, but this one is actually hard for me. I easily take on the emotional field of someone else's feeling. But I know that. So my strength is in knowing that I can remind myself I have a choice. I don't have to be mad because someone else is mad, right? I can honor their madness and listen to their story, but I don't have to become mad. Undifferentiation sets vague goals. You know, what is your goal? I don't know. I want Chris to stop screaming. You know, why? Seek security. Don't upset others. You know, let's not talk about that now. That'll upset people. People are differentiated when they take a stand based on values. You know, like when I look at our principles, it calls me to. When I think about our mission, it calls me to. Although, as I say that, I will be honest, I have sat in meetings with very good and loyal members who had different positions because sometimes our principles bring us into conflict because we don't all agree about what they mean, right? And our interpretation of them. So it's also possible to take a stand based on your values and find yourself disagreeing with someone for how they're interpreting one of our principles. But I think if we can talk about that, that's the success, right? We don't all have to agree because we're not going to cut each other off just because we disagree, right? That would be anxiety. Differentiation, we focus on ourselves. We're self-aware. I know what my triggers are. I know how I deal with conflict because I have been honest, at least with myself, about how I respond to conflict. I know how I hold conflict based on my childhood experiences, and I know what triggers me. So I know how to calm myself when I get triggered. We stay connected to others. We're not trying to emotionally connect, but we stay connected. You sound angry. I want to hear what's upsetting you. I'm not getting angry like you are, but I'm staying in relationship with you, right? This one really helped me actually when someone would come up to me angry after services about anything, right? I'm like, phew, I finished worship on Sunday and someone is really angry about an adult education program being offered in a month. And I'm like, whoa, you know, that would have felt like it came out of nowhere, but for someone it was really important. And what I would remind myself is I want to be in relationship with them. So I'd be like, well, tell me why this is so upsetting to you. Because I wanted to stay connected. Differentiation, we set clear goals and we seek challenges, right? We do the hard work. We don't expect it to always be easy or have an answer. Here's your last reflection. This is it. This is the last one. In the conflict in your congregation that you thought of, where could differentiation and a non-anxious presence make a difference or have made a difference, however you want to think about it? And it could have been if you could have acted, and we'll try and focus on yourself because you're the only one you control, right? Where could differentiation on your part and a non-anxious presence on your part make a difference? What role did you play in the conflict, okay? How did it relate to the role you played in your childhood home? Did you stand on the sideline because you're terrified of conflict? Did you feel like a deer in the headlight because that's how you used to feel? Did you lead the charge because that's what you did? And then here's the great question. What role might you play? Just because the script was written for you in childhood, you get to write it how you want it now. Like, what role could you play when you think of the current conflict? So go ahead and take a few minutes to think about that. That's thinking creatively with differentiation. All right, I have 2 more slides. Here's some of my final thoughts on anxiety. First, it's often a great time to reframe the problem. So someone's upset to you because someone's fighting in the kitchen, rather than trying to solve the fight because someone told you that's what you should do, right? You could say, you could ask that person, why does that matter so much to you that they're fighting? You know, you can reframe a problem how you think would help people hold the deeper, more important stories, right? It's an opportunity for us always to learn, to grow, to try something new, to listen to others, to set boundaries, to develop policies. Our former regional lead, Ian Evison, used to always say, conflict is not inherently bad or good. It's actually an opportunity. We can learn from it. It's always going to happen. And if we engage productively, where people listen, work on things, if we can maintain the level of anxiety to a bearable place, you can get some really terrific work done. And often it's only when there is some kind of pain or anxiety that change will really happen. So it's not inherently bad. We don't need to be afraid of it. Although for some of us growing up, conflict was very scary in our homes, so then we're a little bit more hesitant. As someone else said to me, a lay member, the great is the enemy of the good. You know, I threw perfect out the window with conflict and anxiety. You know, like we all have better days, worse days. You know, it's like we're trying to do what we can. We're trying to do what we can in anxious times with anxious people. When my heart and mind are anxious, I'm just doing the best I can, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And yes, I'm going to make mistakes. It's not if, it's when, and yes, I will, and I'm going to feel like that a little orangutan, but that's okay. I'm still lovable, okay? We're all still lovable when we err. And the one thing you can control is yourself, right? You can say you're sorry. You can start over. You can ask for clarification. You can say, I don't know what I think. Sometimes anxious people want an answer right away, and you know what? It's completely fair to say, I don't know, that sounds really big, I need to sleep on it. That's completely fair, right? So, and then here's my last slide. When I teach, I always ask people, every session I end with these 3 things. I learned this from a student at our Midwest Leadership School. See, I learn when I go. She was a teacher. Her name's Carrie. And she would always say, it's great to end a lesson thinking, what are 3 connections to your life, 2 things you want to remember, and 1 question you still have, okay? I'm going to let you sit with this slide for a few minutes, and then I'm going to take your questions and we can have a little bit of a conversation. But if you even write some of the connections to your life, things to remember, and questions, we can start there, unless you have some other pressing things. All right, I'm going to end the slideshow now and come back and I can see you. All right. All right. So let's start, if anyone, and remember this webinar is being recorded, so you might want to be mindful of the questions you ask, the situations you describe. Just think about that. Oh, and I see some things in the chat. Let me start there. Someone writes, our small congregation has a real issue with, quote, personal issues with members. I'd love to hear more about what that is, if that person would like to write more or say more. Oh, and someone else wrote, it can be difficult for some of us at least, okay, me, I love the honesty, to distinguish staying connected to others from accommodating others. Yeah, and that's why I really encourage you to not be too hard on yourself. I think there's days you walk away and you're like, I don't know, did I cross that line? Did I want to cross that line? Was that okay to cross that line? I think that's actually the work. And being mindful and having a little humility and self-doubt sounds like a real appropriate place to be. And all of us like err on feeling more comfortable being direct or indirect, like more accommodating, less accommodating. Like everyone defers to one side or the other. What I find is a balance is good. So I actually hear that one a lot. I often felt maybe I was being a little too accommodating. On the other hand, the benefit was sometimes that helped group stays together longer. On the other hand, a downside could have been we didn't talk about as many hard things. So there's always an upside and a downside. Someone wrote, email can be a factor in an anxious system. Boy, can it. We have some real issues with people trying to have substantial conversations on social media or email. So if you have anything significant to say, anything involving emotions, I actually, if someone sends me an email, I say, let's talk on the phone, let's set a time. I like immediately kind of try and corral that one with a, I want to talk to you, because people get into such trouble emailing because they can't see the other person's response or sense it or feel it. Or hear it. So I totally agree with that one. And then someone writes, within our board, we have a covenant rule. Any member can end an email conversation, refer to it in a yes, that's just what I said. Tom is a graduate of our leadership school. Look at that. All right. So does, let me, well, I don't want to unmute all of you, but do you know how to unmute yourself? It's the bottom on the left, the button on the left. You can unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can put something in the chat. If no one has a pressing question right now, I would love to go to, did any of this material make a connection to your life that you would want to say something about? Like, you're like, oh, I suddenly realized I always get mad at this, or this makes me anxious. So anyone have anything they want to share about a connection to your life from this material?
It does look like someone had another comment on the chat on email. What do you do when someone keeps insisting on email communication?
Oh, I see. Thank you, Jonala. What do you do when someone keeps insisting on email communication even when it's not going well? I think you get to set the parameters if you need to. You know, I think you need to, but okay, then I also wonder about like power in a system. So like, I always think like, why might that person feel that way? So then I might want to double check with someone who's like, when I was a minister, someone on my ministerial relations committee, or the board president. If we had a right relations committee, sometimes you can go to them and be like, what do you think? I'm concerned about how this is going. Not so much that I want to out someone, but I want to be mindful that I could have a blindness. No, I don't use that word. That feels ableist. I could have a, I could be missing why someone would feel more comfortable doing it on email. And I could be interpreting it in a way it's not meant. On the other hand, there could be someone who's really engaging in negative behaviors we don't want. And so I want a different voice than my own to help me think that through. I want a thought partner, essentially, and see if we can work on doing that. But I also wonder, why do people insist on email? What does that mean? You know, it's an interesting question. Thanks, Jonala. I want to go back to it. It can be where the Committee on Ministry comes in. It kind of depends on your situation too. It also depends on power in systems, like who has what power. It can depend on also presentational behavior styles. You know, like some people are really aggressive on email and it's not conducive to relationship building. It could be someone's a shut-in and has trouble getting out. I mean, or doesn't like talking on the phone because that's hard for, I mean, but sussing out why is email important to you now? I'm feeling like if we talked about this on the phone or in person, that would be better. Is it a time issue? Is it something else? I don't know. Other people. If you want to share a connection to your life or something you want to remember, or even a question you still have, I'd love to hear those. You are so silent, I am concerned. Okay. I think that sometimes email gives some people time to think before they respond. Again, okay, so this is like this interesting connection to others. Like we could assume the worst about someone wanting to say an email, but we could also be like, it could be someone wants to think about something, or someone is so afraid of getting overwhelmed by their emotions in person, it doesn't feel possible for them. So that's where, in trying to calmly learn a little bit why without judging or demeaning, sometimes we can come to an understanding. Like someone might say to you, I'm afraid I'll cry if I talk to you about this to you in person. You can be like, oh. And then, you know, however you want to respond, like, I think we would be okay if that happened. I might cry in front of you too. I mean, I don't know, but do you see how like that brings you closer, having the conversation rather than assuming and cutting off? Although sometimes it's not great to do stuff on email, but yes, thinking through, some people need to organize their thoughts. Okay. Someone wrote, connection to my work life is an easy one. We are in interim ministry. Yeah, interim ministry is a very in-between time. If you're doing the work, you should be, hopefully, thinking about some of the things maybe that haven't been ideal or that you hope for. That can be a bit of a tough place for a congregation to be in. Someone writes, we have one person who has hearing challenges and strongly prefers text or email. Yes, that's a very real issue. And then if that is the way they always do it, do you need to have some shared conversation in whatever way you can about what are some ground rules for that email conversation, right? Because you don't want it going off the rails because it's only email. But yeah, sure, there's an auditory issue. Someone wrote, I'm having trouble differentiating between emotional fusion and cutoff. It seems like both are isolating an identified patient. I think of the cutoff as the walk away. I'm walking away from you, talk to the hand, slam the door. And then the emotional fusion is an assistance. Tell me a little bit more, the person who wrote that, about both are isolating an identified patient. Tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking there. I'm not sure I'm picking up what you're laying down, so to speak. And someone wrote, in my family of origin, I was always expected to be silent. So now if I stand up for myself in person, I feel terrible about it. So it is actually anxiety producing. Thank you, this person, for putting out there what so many of us actually experience. You know, I have observed some people have no trouble getting up in front of a group and telling them exactly what they're doing wrong or how they disagree. And then for some people, it's such a moment of terror. So part of your challenge then is what can support you if you feel like you have to say something? Do you need to rehearse it in advance? Do you need someone next to you to help you, even that they're sitting there and they're going to be there when you sit back down after you're done speaking? And often our families teach us one thing, but it's like what we learned as a kid with our kid brain, right? The kid brain is like, keep yourself safe. You need these people, they feed you, right? And then as an adult, we have some choices. I'm going to get fed whichever decision I make, you know, in general. and getting support for yourself, but also we all have the capacity to do all these different things, whether it's being silent, listening, yelling, proclaiming, whatever it is. It's actually nice to know and experiment with all the tools in our toolbox, because we're all going to need them as human beings, right? We're all going to need them at some point. So you can even think of it as like, how can you baby step yourself into this work, and to know what your triggers are. That's like terrific. That's the knowing what triggers you is part of the answer to having more tools and capabilities. So that's great. Someone writes, our current issue is that the two members who have had a falling out do not want to meet together and discuss the issue. Yeah, and if they won't, they won't, because we don't control other people, and that is hard. That is painful. It's painful too if they're talking to other people in the system, like weaving them in. And there might need to be conversations about, I know you don't want to talk to each other, but depending on if you like have a right relations committee, it's not great though if they're lining up enemies and allies. That's not optimal situation there that you're talking about. But we cannot make people talk who do not want to, and it's kind of not our job to. Okay, with the fusion cutoff, I guess I'm looking at it from a problem person perspective. Either way, their opinion is being ignored. So what's the difference? It's true. And remember how we talked about in differentiation, you stay connected, even though you don't agree with their you don't have to suck up the emotional field, but you can stay connected. That's like that's the problem with anxious systems. They push people away and out of relationship so that we can't work on, do we have any shared ground? Can we still learn from each other? I mean, I sometimes think in an anxious world, we have this fantasy that we can't get along, or we hate each other, or there's so many differences. And there are a ton of differences, and there are a ton of differences that make a difference. And sometimes we can still have breakthroughs, right? You know, there are some things we can all agree that we care about sometimes, or maybe you share a hobby or something. I have a friend who I've watched become have values that are more and more different from my own. But because we have a shared story from our past, I'm still able to stay in relationship with this person. And what I notice about them is that fear is really motivating them. And so then I can take a compassionate stance with this person, but it's because of our shared past history. So I always look for those connections that can weave us together. And actually, when I was a minister, whoever made me the most anxious in the congregation, I would work at having a positive conversation with them once a month. And it could include, I hear you garden. Yes, I'm growing tomatoes. I like tomatoes. Great. I succeeded. I was not going for like the Nobel Peace Prize or a scientific revelation. I was going for, we had one productive conversation on anything, okay? And I would intentionally find the people I found the most agitating, made me the most angry or uncertain about myself, or had caused problems. And it was intentional so that we would have something shared. I felt it was my job to reach back. And this person has a right to not want to be in relationship with me, although like as the minister of the church, it was kind of hard to avoid me. But I wanted to make sure I had prepared a stance where I was open to them and that was displayed. That's what I was looking for. Even if they didn't really want to chat, I'm like, that's okay, they don't need to. I don't control other people, right? I'm controlling me having an open stance. In my family of origin, I was often the person who was cut off. Ugh, it was so painful when you're the cut off one. And now I suspect I may defensively engage in cutting off others. You are a genius. That's part of the reason I have us do the exercise. Whatever habits we learned, we tend to perpetuate, or when we're afraid, we engage in them. I do not mind saying to this group, because it is not remotely top secret, that there are several habits I learned in my childhood that really don't help me as an adult. And I spend a lot of time thinking, that's what I want to do, but I don't think that's going to help me or the situation, and I'm going to choose to do something differently. That's why I also ask you about like your role in conflict as a child, because we default to that. It's familiar, it's behaviorally familiar. Even if it leads to a bad outcome, it's one we're familiar with, right? You know, like everyone left yelling, we're like, well, I know that one. You know, I don't know what I would do if someone stopped and started to cry and said, I feel hurt. That would be like more terrifying, right? We'd all, so I love this. Yes. And I love this program that says you're only as sick as your secrets, which doesn't mean you need to tell your secrets to everyone. It just means you need to know them yourself, right? What silently motivates you, what triggers you. All those things are so, so very important. Yes. So then if you know or wonder if you're defensively engaging in cutoff, you can choose to try to experiment with something different at times, right? Baby step into something different. And again, this is where the perfect is the enemy of the good. You're not wanting to become Mother Teresa in that moment. You're just like, could you experiment with not lashing out? Could you experiment with taking a breath and sleeping on it, right? That would be great. That would be amazing if you're wondering about if you cut people off. And everyone gets anxious, so we all do this. And so you can imagine too, we're all in the room and some of us have learned to cut people off and some of us have learned that we all need to agree, and then we're trying to work on hard stuff together. No wonder it's hard, right? Okay, I'm not sure about that message from Tom. It sounds like you're communicating with someone else. You go, Tom. And then someone else writes, a connection for me is the idea that we are all replaying and relearning the system we grew up with. Yep. And hi, Rachel. You were at school. Someone else at Midwest Leadership School. It has been so helpful to continue to explore these dynamics in many areas of my life, including dealing with my family of origin. Yes, 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 and yes. Did anyone have some questions, or would you like to talk more about or chat a little bit about connections to your life or things you like to remember? I also don't believe we have to, hold this webinar until 9 o'clock. If you're like, I've had my moment, it's good. But if there's more to say, I want to leave space for it. You're welcome, Tom. Something I always felt as a minister is I got a little bit of training about this, the work of family systems theory, and I always felt like it's kind of unfair. I mean, I got it in seminary. No one's trying to be unfair, but I was like, boy, I really feel like the laity are down a peg that no one even like broaches that this is something they might want to reflect on at some point, because having this in mind often helped me walk away and consider, how did I want to position myself in a difficult situation? Like when people were yelling, I wanted to be calm, and I would like talk to myself before, like, whatever happens, don't lose your temper. It's not going to help, and I was like, gosh, it kind of would help our laity if someone just tipped them off that this is out there for them, which is my point to this webinar, basically. Any last words, questions, comments, connections?
So Sharon, I'm curious. I feel like a lot of what I've been hearing you talk about is meeting people where they are, which is great.
Yes.
And 100% yeah, that. I am wondering if there is an aspect or there's a way also about challenging people to grow their skills too, so that it's not. I mean, to me, it feels like that there's this, you can build a skill. Anyway, is there an angle about that you might talk about?
Yes, so here, let me reveal something to you. Those of us who go to seminary, we have these testing done, and for those of you who know me, you can go giggle about this, but I tested as someone who was aggressive and struggled with aggression, and I'll just tell you that's not the way anyone perceives me. I've never told that to anyone who knew what I was talking about, but I tested that way, and I was like, I went away and I said, people who have been in this field have perceived I test this way and that I better learn more about it because I'm going to get myself and other people into trouble with it. So I chose to proactively, whether the feedback was true or not, do work on how did I respond in situations of conflict, and what was the difference between being proactive and overly aggressive. So I don't feel like I can tell someone like, you know, you and you and you need work on X. What I can suggest to all of us is we need work on some X, and it is our work to figure out what our X is, okay? But since I control me, I spend a lot of time figuring out what my X is. And when I'm mindful about what my X is, I'm a lot less resentful when things don't go my way, and they don't always go my way. I'm like, you know, I'm trying to keep my side of the street clean here. I'm trying to know myself. I'm being honest about my triggers. I can't make people respond the way I want to. How do I want to respond? And how do I want to respond where I'm not scared Sharon, the child with conflict in my childhood home, but I'm adult Sharon who has choices and tools in her toolkit. That's what I would say. We all have work to do. But only you can do your work, and only you truly know your work. Is that a little bit about what you were thinking, or are you thinking something else, Seth?
No, that's a great response. I guess part of what I'm curious about is like cultures, institutions have patterns, right? Like if it triggers an anxiety, they might be super conflict avoidant.
Yes.
About like people, you know, having difficult experiences at home, conflict provoking anxiety. And so I was just wondering if there was any, maybe the answer is no, we need to focus on ourselves, but I was wondering if there's anything we could do to try and encourage like systems or folks to like practice doing the conflict. So
yeah. Okay. Now I know you're understanding your question at another level. So for example, if you feel like you are in a conflict of avoidance system, and by the way, most of you congregations are conflict avoidant, and that's generally because they have had some incredibly painful conflict and it has gone quite badly. So generally there's scars there behind that avoidance. What I would think of are, what are the baby steps where we can move people forward? The challenge of working on conflict in a congregation is that you have 100, maybe 200 people with 100 or 200 different ways of understanding conflict and a backstory to match it. So you are both trying to move ahead the person who's like, let's fist fight out in the parking lot, with the person who's like, we will not speak of this, we will drink coffee together, okay? So how can you keep the group engaged together becomes your task. You're not gonna have some breakthrough. You're gonna like, what are the baby steps to keep the group together so they develop enough skills to stay together to have more conversations? You're talking about a 5 to 10 to 15 year journey. It's not one consultant one day, you know, so maybe it is a book, maybe it is a movie, maybe it's like you try and talk about your covenant a little bit more, maybe you form a right relations committee, maybe you argue about that a little bit and shift what they do, maybe talk about the challenges the committee has and figuring out what it does. All of those steps give people some more tools and resources in this work. I think it's really slow, and the challenge is keeping the group together because it's a very, very diverse group. Someone wrote, a delightful instructor in a workshop helped me with the clue. I could see how you might think that if the information you had was reflect back their stance, but what you didn't know was fill in the rest of the story. Yeah, I think that could work sometimes. Yeah. I hope you'll all be very good to yourself. We live in anxious times. You know, it's kind of like that, the old adage with, you know, the airplane, you know, you got to put on your face mask first. So, you know, honestly, what is the self-care you need to give yourself so that you can position yourself to be in our world right now and in our congregations when they're a little distressed, you know, so take care of yourself, be kind, find the loving caretaker inside of you if the world doesn't feel like it can care for you, right? We have to care for ourselves. So that's also something else that we need to do in the midst of all of this. So I'm going to end here. It was just, thank you for spending your evening with me when you, I think, could have been watching a debate and maybe still can watch a debate. And you're welcome, Jen. Thanks, Barb. Bye, all. Good night.